these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, folks. Look, if you're feeling like the world is falling apart, if you feel like the interconnectedness, the sort of paradise that humanity's been living in for the last 70 years is unraveling, if you feel like it really shouldn't have been there to begin with, I want to give you some hope, but my guest does not. My guest is Peter Zeihan. He is a geopolitical strategist, founder of the consulting firm Zeihan on Geopolitics. His clients include energy corporations, financial institutions, business associations, agricultural interests, universities, U.S. military, U.S. Congress as of today. He authored The Accidental Superpower, The Absent Superpower, and The Disunited Nations. And it just came out with a book about how the world is ending. So Peter, let's jump right into it. First of all, thanks for being on.
It's great to be here while we still have time.
All right, so let's jump right into what you mean by the end of what the book is called. The End of the World is just the beginning, right? What do you mean by the end of the world?
There are two things that have dominated our world for the last 70 years. After World War II, the Americans created the globalized order, enabling anyone to trade with anyone for anything at any time and to sell in any market if in exchange you would side with us against the Soviets. And it worked, but the Cold War ended 30 years ago, and in every presidential election since, we've gone with the more populist candidate. So that's not an aberration, that's a trend. We're done. Mm-hmm. And then second, when globalization happened, it enabled the spread of capital and technology to every corner of the world. And people started moving off subsistence farms and into the cities to take manufacturing and service jobs. You do that for 70 years and it changes everything about how you live. Most notably, when you're on the farm, kids are free labor, so you have a lot. But when you move into cities, they become very expensive moving pieces of furniture, and you have fewer because adults aren't dumb. After 70 years, most of the world now has more people in their 50s than their 40s and their 30s and their 20s. And so the consumption model that we've all grown up with and had our professional lives in, that's already over. And now the question is, what pieces of this can transition to something else? And it's a pretty short list.
Okay, so it seems like there's two overarching reasons that you cite. One is America's reluctance to police global shipping lanes in a very serious way, and to actively prevent any kind of war from happening. I do want to chat about that, and then the other trend you see seems to be simple demographics. The aging populations make it hard to maintain the consumer base that sort of drives. Well, all of it. I mean, whether it's an export-led economy or even our own economy. Let's get the good news right up at the front, just for the listeners, that like the U.S. is in a very good place compared to everybody else on this particular problem.
Absolutely. Everything that we use in the world is transported across international borders, but that's not true for everyone. So in the case of North America, for example, we do the majority of our non-electronics manufacturing within North America. That is reshoring at an incredible rate. We are already the world's largest producer of crude oil and natural gas, and we are actually significant exporters of that as well as refined product. And we are the world's largest agricultural producer and the world's largest agricultural exporter. So there are definitely hiccups along the road. I mean, if you can't just dissolve the world in a day and expect us to not notice, we will. It will be awkward. But 5 years, 10 years from now, once this transition is passed, we'll have supply chains that are close to home that involve Mexico, Canada, and ourselves. We'll have a transport system that is largely internal, and the United States will be in a better place with stronger growth and lower inflation than any other place in the world. But we have to get there first. You don't do that overnight.
The stronger place in the rest of the world is that. What about compared to now? What about compared to, what many consider to be, despite all our complaining, because we complain a lot, as any good people should, but compared to the last 20 years, how does that period look?
Well, that's kind of a fun thing, because the last 20 years is all in the post-Cold War system. So the first big wave of globalization was mostly among the allies during the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, most of the rest of the world came along. And so the last 20, 30 years, that has been the fastest period of growth in trade and in standards of living and in GDP in human history. It's been fantastic, but it was always artificial. So what we now have to do is that in reverse, and then some of the Cold War expansion in reverse. So we're in a world right now where there are a large number of secondary powers, whether it's China or Russia or the EU, and they're just not going to survive this transition. China is going to be the biggest splash when it goes down. The Russians will probably be the loudest, all things considered, with the war. The Europeans, there's a number of ways that can break down. Not all of them are completely horrific, but most of them are going to see a significant breakdown in Europe's ability to trade. So we're going to go from kind of a step above first amongst equals where we are now to North America, South America, and then everybody else pretty far below.
So you envision this sort of regionalized new world order, whereas now, like, somebody starting a business can look at supply chains all over the world and be pretty confident. I mean, maybe not like now.
Yeah, like 2 years ago, sure.
Yeah, the supply chains kind of suck at the moment, but for a long time now, they can be like, well, okay, I can buy it here a little cheaper. Let's, we can do business there. And I can feel like the government, whatever government, isn't going to confiscate my property. I feel like the ship won't get mauled by pirates. You think that's changing?
That's absolutely changing. We're already seeing that in the case of the Chinese system with the COVID lockdowns. Their vaccine,
they're crazy,
doesn't work. So lockdowns are their only option to avoid millions of deaths. I mean, look at Omicron B. I mean, we've kind of forgotten about this in the United States. We've stopped caring about it back in January. But Omicron B is the most communicable pathogen we've ever had. And Omicron B is the most lethal of the COVID variants to date. Now, everyone in the United States either has the vaccine or natural antibodies or both. China has neither of those. So if they open up, they're just absolutely screwed. But you're seeing some version of this going on elsewhere with security issues, with energy issues, with food issues. And so those supply chains that we thought were inviolable no longer are. But most importantly, and we haven't gotten to this stage yet, we're used to trade, physical transport on the water being safe and cheap. And that's just not the case anymore. We had the Europeans step up to the plate with their oil embargo for Russian crude this week. And the most important part of that is they're banning all insurance for all vessels that carry Russian product. That's the start of the unraveling of what makes transport globally. Mm-hmm. And since in the case of manufactured goods, the average product crosses international borders 100 times. And in East Asia, every single one of those crossings is by water. The ability of this to disintegrate very quickly is something we have not priced in.
And you made the argument that actually I've started following your work pretty recently and heard your podcast on Harbinger, Josh Harbinger.
Yes.
Yeah. Great podcast. It was, about why we should care about Ukraine. And I think the overarching point, it was a really interesting conversation for a whole variety of reasons on just Russian history, how they think, why they did what they did now. But also interesting as to how these second and third order effects happen. And I was reading another article where you're seeing the collapse of Sri Lanka and how part of that, one factor there was because a lot of their tourism, the main funding that they have for their industries come from Ukraine and Russia.
Absolutely.
This interconnectedness can unravel rather quickly.
Throw some Chinese debt on top of that just to kind of make it the trifecta.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's easy to see how that's, and one of the questions I want to ask you throughout this conversation is what other, what events are supporting your thesis here, and maybe what events are countering it?
Well, the biggest counter, of course, is the Chinese are still there. There's
around.
Very little about the Chinese system that any standard economist is going to be able to look at and say, oh, yeah, that's going to last. But yet they are still here 30 years on. The issue to watch with China now is that their labor costs have increased at a faster clip than at any time in history in any country, including the Black Death. They're now at about 14 or 15 times the labor costs that they had back in 1999, but their labor productivity has only gone up by a factor of 2 or 3. They're dying. One-child policy 40 years on, combined with the world's most rapid urbanization, There just aren't enough people under age 35 in China left to even theoretically repopulate the country. And if the more recent data that's come out of the Chinese census is accurate, they overcounted their population in excess of 100 million people, most of whom would have been women. So we were already looking at one of the 2 or 3 most fastest aging countries in the world before this. Now they're on a completely different scale. And even with the old data, the younger data, they aged past the United States back in 2017. So we're looking at a country that is going from pre-industrial standards of subsistence agriculture to a complete post-industrial collapse within a lifetime with 20 years to spare.
And that's quite the prediction. You make a pretty good case for it, right? Because it's not just their demographics; it's their overfinancing of literally everything. I think, and I certainly agree with this. I mean, people sometimes look to them and say, well, their strength is they can plan 50 years ahead, and they're very scientific and technocratic and how they
They're
govern.
really not.
Yeah. So talk about that for a second. I mean, let's make the case for the Chinese collapse, and then how does that affect us? I mean, on the one hand, like we've got a pretty anti-China American sentiment right now.
There's
for a
been
lot
an
of good
evolution,
reasons.
yes.
That being said, if it collapsed right now, it would feel some pain. But I don't think it'll collapse overnight, right? It'll happen over time. But let's make the case for people.
Well, let's start with the second piece there. Chinese history is replete with examples of how it can all go to hell in a very short period of time. So I am not making a prediction on specifically how it will go down. There are just too many paths forward. Sometimes it is overnight. Sometimes it's over a year. Sometimes it's over a generation. Demographics gives us a hard stop of 10 years. So it's between now and then on some sort of time frame. As for
very soon.
Yeah, it's very, very soon. Geopolitically speaking, this is practically a blink in an eye. Demographically speaking as well. But let's talk about that finance model, because that kind of puts to pain the entire idea that the Chinese are good planners. They're really not. The whole idea of the Asian financial model is that capital, cash, whatever it happens to be, is a good of the state. It exists to serve political purposes, not economic ones. So in the United States, if you take out a loan, you have to show a business plan, you have to offer collateral. And if you don't follow your plan, or if you don't pay back your loan, you lose your collateral. This is what we consider normal. That is not how it works in China. In China, you have to show your employment plan. And if you can guarantee a large number of people will be working at a job, regardless of what that job does, you get money, because it's all about preventing large groups of workers from going on long walks together. Development from an American point of view is about building infrastructure, building productive capacity, serving a market, growing the business. In China, it's about achieving strategic goals, making sure that the population doesn't rebel, making sure they can dominate specific industries, not on efficiency or on cost, but simply because of mass output. So they put a lot of cash into industrial plant, not to produce anything in particular, just to produce a lot of stuff. And this is one of the many ways that the Chinese ended up going from being a backwards country to producing more steel and more cement than the rest of the world combined. As recently as 7 years ago. And then they just have to dump it on the international market because there's not even a capacity in China to absorb it all. That's incidentally one of the reasons why One Belt, One Road is out there. It's a product disposal program. Yeah, product disposal program. There we go.
Yeah.
Too many words too early in the morning. Moving forward, you can apply this to every sector of the Chinese system. And in the sectors where the Chinese are not as productive, they have to put more and more cash behind it, and it's more and more wasteful. So the overall sector that is most exposed to this sort of financing is agriculture. Chinese land writ large is only about 1/5 the productivity of the global average. So they have to put in scads more, in case of some fertilizers, 5 and 6 times as much to get the same amount of calories out. It's particularly bad with infrastructure. We are now in the early stages of the Chinese following the Japanese program of building roads to places where no one lives. And of course, we've all heard about the ghost cities. These are not the plans of a country that is planning 30, 40, 50 years down the line. These are the operations of a country that has one goal: make sure there's not an internal rebellion. Now, separate from the book, separate from the long-term situation, we've had a government collapse in China over the last year. Xi is now exiled or imprisoned or executed pretty much everyone in the country who is capable of independent thought. And so we're now getting these catastrophic countrywide policies because it's a cult of personality. Nobody wants to bring him in for any information, but if he gives a speech on TV, they take that as their marching orders and they interpret that the way they think that the guy who kills the messenger wants it to be interpreted. So this is how you get places in Shanghai, like literally going out and disinfecting the runways. I'm just ridiculous policies from a health and a development point of view. And it's happening in electricity, it's happening in transport, it's happening in manufacturing. And so we even got Apple, like the quintessential American company that has outsourced its entire supply chain. Every time there's been a writing on the wall that there's a genocide or there's a crackdown in Hong Kong or there's inefficiency or labor costs are going, every single time that something has come up, the Apple has doubled down on China. So now 92%, I believe, of their supply chain is internal to China. And even they started looking last month at other options for the first time.
There's a lot. I hear that from all over the business community, which is good. Like, it makes our job up here easier because I'm not sure how Congress fixes our supply chain problem. I'm not sure how we make it more resilient, a little closer to home, a little more reliable. The government intervention in these things is
messy.
It's messy. There's no obvious solution. The best solution is the continued messaging that China sucks and you shouldn't do business there. And there's inevitable conflict at some point, and then your business is really going to go down in flames. So it's just best that you diversify. Frankly, that messaging is working to an extent, and obviously people just see what's going on there as well. It was Jordan Arbinger. I said Josh earlier.
Oh,
it was on that
I
podcast.
thought it was Josh too.
and one thing you mentioned on that podcast was it is related to what you just said was you think Xi Jinping didn't even know about these massive Chinese blackouts throughout the country, like they don't want to tell him.
Well, we didn't get our first policy to address it until April. So we've had rolling blackouts in the country that is supposedly the second largest economy and the manufacturing superpower, and they lasted for a year before we got a policy change. That does not tell me that there's an efficient state apparatus in place.
So what should well, actually, I want to focus on those two themes again, sure. Demographics and American withdrawal, specifically the American withdrawal one. I mean, so you say we've gotten more, our presidents have increasingly gotten more populist. By that, do you mean, because populism is usually associated with some form of isolationism,
often, yes.
A reluctance, so I don't think George Bush had that tendency, but Barack Obama,
Trump and Biden absolutely do.
Right. And Barack Obama also campaigned on it. Now, Obama and Trump campaigned on it, I think acted pretty differently. To an extent. Well, different than their rhetoric. Yeah. I mean,
that's fair.
I mean, because people hail Trump as this like isolationist, like that kind of far right sort of wing that just loves isolationism. They hail Trump as their leader, but I'm like, Trump immediately got to office and put a ton of troops in Syria and just kicked a bunch of ass. That guy murdered an Iranian general. Like he's not a do nothing. Like, he doesn't
fair.
have that mentality.
Fair. No, it's
Biden definitely kept his promises.
From my point of view, it's as much economic as it is strategic. So under Obama was the first president we had in 30 years that didn't negotiate a single free trade pact. Trump walked away from a number. He did renegotiate NAFTA, which honestly I thought was great because it redefined what the American economy is in the minds of the far right. So Mexico's now in the club, which is brilliant moving forward. Mexico has one of the healthiest demographies in the world.
Right. So, okay. So, I guess the question I'm asking is, why do you think this happened? Right. Was it a matter of just because we've always had an isolationist streak in American politics. I mean, it took us like a long time to get involved in World War II. We had to watch country after ally after country just fall to Hitler. Eventually we got around to it. So that streak is always going to be there. I think it's frankly just part of the human brain wired. I think there's always a percentage of people that, are more apt that way. But is it also because of just the impracticality of it? Because, we didn't have these near peer competitors after the fall of the Soviet Union. And as we start to see that, Is it just, even if we wanted to, is it just impossible to truly prevent conflict?
Let me put my personal cards on the table so you know where I'm coming from. I'm a bit of a globalist. I'm an Atlanticist. I see the rapid expansion of things like NAFTA and NATO to other countries as the most reliable way of ensuring American security and wealth for the long term. But people who believe my way have lost all 7 of the last presidential elections. So again, not an aberration, it's a trend. Isolation in the American system comes and goes more than it does with most countries, because for the United States, since we've broadly secured what we need here in North America, we always have the option of looking out and we always have the option of looking in. And so when we do see something that's an opportunity or a threat across the ocean, we will rise to the occasion and we will deal with it. Maybe not on a time frame that a lot of other countries would like, but we do. What was unique about the post-World War II environment was that for the first time in dealing with that threat, we found ourselves occupying territory because so many countries had fallen, and we felt the need that we had to make sure that Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany did not resuscitate themselves in a short period of time like Imperial Germany, not into Nazi Germany. That required boots on the ground, and that required something that we usually don't have in foreign policy in this country, a plan. And that plan was globalization, and it lasted for 70 years. It is the longest term bipartisan foreign policy we have ever had, but it achieved its goal 30 years ago. And so there was always going to be a need for, if not a withdrawal or a rejiggering, a redefinition. And the president who tried to get America to have that conversation with itself, what sort of world do we want to leave for the next generation? That was George Herbert Walker Bush, and we punished him for it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we're a democracy. This is ultimately on us. Yeah. But then we elected a series of people who have decided that it was time to loosen the ties that bind between us and the rest of the world. And since globalization ultimately was a bribe, you let us write your security policies. In exchange, you can sell into our market and access anything else. That's a subsidy. And when you carry out a subsidy for 30 years, but you don't get the strategic benefit, people get annoyed. And so we got Obama and we got Trump, and now we have Biden. And if you look at what, say, Biden is doing with the Russians right now, part of me is thrilled that we're finally leading a coalition again. But you'll notice there's nothing economic about it. This is a fair weather friends coalition when we all have the same strategic goal. There is no guns for butter trade this time around. So as soon as this war is finished, that is probably the end of the coalition. That's a very different sort of engagement compared to what we've been used to since World War II.
Yeah, and that's interesting. The term globalist has a really ugly connotation to it. It's got a bad reputation. I'm not sure that. So there's the people who scream globalist at the top of their lungs. They get really upset about it.
If you're talking global government, yeah, that doesn't happen. If you're talking
exactly, but that's what they mean.
Exactly. If you're talking a global exchange of goods and coming to a common format for how things should work, I'm that flavor of globalist.
Right. It just you're gonna make everybody think that you're like heading the World Economic Forum.
I've seen that. They just take it as an opportunity to do shots. It's kind of amusing.
Yeah, it's look, on my side of the politics, there's a lot of attention on the World Economic Forum. I mean, one of the most hilarious conspiracies is that I'm secretly part of it. So I'm just because they added me to their website once as this list of future leaders, and I was like, okay, it's not like we have some secret email chain, guys. But conspirators are going to conspiracize or whatever. So, I mean, but I think still the majority of Americans think we should do, the vast majority, 80% think we should be giving weapons to Ukraine to fight the Russians. And so, but make the case for it like you did on Arbinger's podcast, maybe briefly. Why does it matter, right? We could survive, obviously, if Russia just took over Ukraine. I think the argument is there's no reason to think Russia stops there, and disorder breeds more disorder, and that disorder screws with our lives in serious and increasingly serious ways. That's my general argument. I'm not sure how you feel.
There's 2 ways you can run it. First, the reason why the Russians are doing this. The Russians have been invaded 50 odd times in their history. And so they see the only way to defend themselves to get a forward military position in the places where those invasions have flowed through. So the Polish Gap, the Bessarabian Gap, those are the two that are in play with the Ukrainians. Ukraine, unfortunately, is just unlucky enough to not be in those gaps, but on the way to the gaps. So it's not that Russia won't stop until it has all of Ukraine. It's that Russia won't stop when it has all of Ukraine. And for the Russians, by their own definition, to feel secure, they have to occupy all or part of about 25 different countries that collectively have twice the population of their own. So that was never going to fly for any number of reasons for any number of countries. There is no deal where you can give them an inch and expect them to be happy, because this is the 8th conflict they've triggered since Putin came in. It will not be the last. So there's something to be said for ending it earlier rather than later. We have learned that lesson repeatedly in American history, whether it was with the British Empire, with the Confederacy, with the Mexicans, with the Canadians, with the Germans, with the Japanese. It's every war we come too late, and then we end up suffering more because of it. One of the great achievements of the post-Cold War era is that we drew a line and we stuck to it. And it was the only era in our history where we actually didn't have to fight the actual war. So that was kind of a nice perk.
Yeah, it certainly was. And frankly, this Russian invasion is the first time that we've had the tougher question of, okay, well, what do you do when it's a nuclear power?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why this is different.
It's difficult. I mean, it's like I'm critical of Biden on about a zillion things. Really everything.
My list is growing.
But on the Ukraine issue, I still have criticisms. I would like them to go, like, if we're going to spend all this money, they need to get them the right stuff, and they need to get it to them now. Otherwise, why are we spending the money? That's sort of my take on it, because I've taken a lot of heat for that. But it's a tough decision, right? Because there is this dance that you play with Putin on how much can you escalate. Now, again, I think we've danced the wrong way. I think we've danced too timidly on this. Just because Putin says it's escalatory doesn't mean he's going to do anything about it. And we've got to call those bluffs. But I get how it's difficult.
Well, there's two problems. Number one, there's a lot of equipment that we could theoretically give the Ukrainians that they've never seen before. So there's a training time frame.
Yeah.
And we are bringing some Ukrainian soldiers out of Ukraine for that training. So that's a pipeline, though. That's not a sudden surge. Yeah. For the stuff that you can suddenly surge, you need things that they know how to use or can use with a minimum of training. The problem we have, the complication that is looming over all of this, is that failed run at Kiev from the third day of the war, that giant convoy. It stalled in a day because they ran out of fuel, and then everyone had to walk back to Belarus on the third day because they ran out of food. And, at one point, everyone in the military was like, this is great. The Russians don't know how to fight a war. And then after they thought about it, that was my
reaction.
Yeah, exactly. Holy crap, the Russians don't know how to fight a war. And they see this as an existential battle for their survival. So we know that if NATO forces come up against Russian forces directly, they can either have a screaming retreat and contemplate the death of their country over the next 20 years, or they can escalate, and they probably would. So it is critical to keep this war bottled up in Ukraine, and it is critical to kill the Russian military here now so that they can never do this again. Secretary Austin was absolutely right with that. The trick is, how do you do that with a force that has insufficient equipment, insufficient training, and poor logistics? There is no good solution here. And any weapons system that would really turn the tide, like, for example, the US would not be engaged with the Russians in an artillery duel. We would use airstrikes. But we can't give the Ukrainians our jets because they would require American pilots and service crews. And if you have that, then you have an American military presence in Ukraine, and you can get that direct clash that we have to avoid. Right. So the weapon systems that could win this for them, they can't have because they can't use them. And that leaves us with this netherworld in between. And it's just not clear how much of the former Soviet satellites that are now NATO allies, how much equipment they have that they can even give the Ukrainians, even if we replace everything in Czech Republic and Poland with F-16s and M1 Abrams immediately. There's a limit, and we're probably going to hit that limit this year. And that counts for us too. We're running out of Stingers and Javelins.
Right. And what the Ukrainians really need, what they're using right now, of course, is what they need is long range artillery to just to create the stalemate. And I'm wondering if, is that the best we can hope for?
A
I tell
still,
people,
yeah.
geostrategically, this war hasn't been terrible for the US. I just hate that it's happened on the backs of Ukrainians, but you've gotten a kind of a reborn NATO alliance. Now you think it's going to crumble as soon as this threat's over, but I'll be the optimist. You can be the pessimist, right?
I've got some experience in that space.
Yeah, yeah, it seems like it's what you do. Just cheer people up, right? So that's happening. I would think that China is looking at this and rethinking an invasion of Taiwan.
Oh, they're so
because
horrified. I mean, it's hard to get a read on. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, like, they've got to realize how hard it is to do a serious maritime invasion. I mean, like people don't realize how good we are in our military. I mean, yeah, we have some woke crap and there's stuff that really annoys me, but for the most part, we understand logistics, we can forward deploy, and we've had a lot of practice at war. We're a very different military pre 9/11 than we are now. We're very good at this stuff.
Especially
And the Chinese have never fought a war. And and Asian culture is not well. They do not have a good predisposition to self-critique. And so it's hard for them to get, I know, because we train with them, right? And they have this honor issue where like they can't be criticized, and so they don't get better. So it's kind of an interesting that people don't really realize. But anyway, go ahead.
I think everything about the Ukraine war has worked out horribly for the Chinese. We now have an insurance ban on maritime shipments of any Russian crude, including things that originate in the Far East, nowhere near the war. So, and the Western techs that have made the eastern half of the Russian energy sector viable over the last 20 years, they're all gone. The Russians don't know how to operate those fields. So the Chinese are looking at a midterm reduction, massive reduction in the ability to import crude and other raw commodities from the Russian space at all. They now know that the idea that this war would be a cakewalk is foolish, because not only have the Taiwanese been preparing for the war for 70 years, they have a moat. And the idea that sanctions and especially boycotts can just come out of nowhere and hit things up into your central bank. I mean, this cuts to the core of the entirety of the Chinese development model. So everything that they thought they were going to be able to walk away with, they now know is not a possibility. And then at the top, you've got this one dude who no longer even has a cadre of smart people that he can send in the other room with some beer and pizza to come up with another plan.
Yeah.
So they're just slamming their head into the wall with their ideology until something cracks, and it's cracking.
What do you think about the worry that America has that some of this is also causing this decoupling from the US dollar, right? You got India buying Russian oil in rubles. The Russians are really
that actually fell through.
Oh, did? Okay.
Yep.
I'm misinformed on that. Well, that's good news, I suppose.
Well, I mean, it doesn't take a reach. Nobody wants rubles and nobody wants rupees.
Yeah. And so do we need to worry about that? Because
No.
there is some push for that as countries like China try to avoid future sanctions.
Every time the United States does something that on a financial point of view, other countries are annoyed by, this conversation bubbles up again. This has been happening back and back and back since the 1980s. And every single time the dollar becomes more central. So the big shift this time around is that the Japanese and the Europeans both basically sublimated their own sanctions program to the US Fed and the US dollar. So they have seen a significant reduction in their global use over the course of the last few months, and the dollar has just gone up and up and up. The only currency swap trades that we have that are of any substance, and there's still less than 2% of the value of trade, is between Russia and China direct. But again, the Chinese don't want rubles and the Russians don't want yuan. The only reason this is working a little bit better this time is when the boycott of the Russian central bank kicked in, about the only foreign currency that the Russians had on hand at home was yuan. So it's really their only option to a certain degree, but they're actually using gold more. They're flying planes of gold to pay for imports right now.
Yeah, and that's fascinating. Like, where do you even get gold these days? I guess you have to be a government to know these.
Well, the Russians are the world's largest producer of gold. They do have the mines and they do have a stockpile. They can play this for at least a year, maybe a little bit longer, but it is a short-term fix.
I mean, they're really playing in like the kind of pre-industrialized system, or at least the pre-globalized system, where it's, an asset-backed monetary system. I actually do want to go back in time, because you do a really excellent job and a very entertaining in a very entertaining way of describing how we got here, how we got to this really high point in history, which is, the post-World War II era of just massive growth, this just-in-time kind of supply chain, the fact that we can actually produce probably more than enough food for our insanely large population, which people scoffed at a certain point in history, that this would even be possible, that we can provide enough energy for everyone. You do a really good job going through the history of, say, energy production, how agriculture got to where it is, how our monetary system got to where it is. I assume, because you're a good public speaker, that you have a way of sort of synthesizing and summarizing that for our audience, because I think it's super interesting.
Oh, let me try. The problem has always been scale. Most countries in most parts of the world for most of history are very easy to disrupt. They don't have secure borders. They don't have everything they need within their own borders. So they can try to make incremental progress in this, that, or the other thing. But whenever there's a war or a boycott or a famine, it all falls apart. What the US fundamentally changed was, because the North American continent has been secure for us for 150 years, we never had to worry about those resets. Even decades like the Great Depression, we exited the decade stronger than we entered it. And that meant that when the United States did decide to get involved with the world as a stabilizing force, we could kind of export that stability. And by making global transport on the ocean safe and cheap for everyone, we could finally have, instead of these hundreds of separate discriminatory economies, all kind of merge into a single global whole. Excuse me, into a single global whole. And that had never happened before in human history. I mean, the closest analog would probably be the Roman Empire, but this is an age before steamships, so you're not moving too fast. And from that, everything suddenly changed, because that meant that everyone could specialize in whatever they did best. So the Koreans went into toys, into heavy industry, and ultimately into semiconductors. The Chinese went into mass manufacturing. So did San Antonio. In terms of energy, places that normally wouldn't be stable enough to support a population because there was no food production could export crude and import food. And that led them to produce more crude and start refining it. So every little bit of the system became fine-tuned for what they did best. My home state of Iowa stopped producing wheat and beef. That all moved to the drier climates of the Great Plains. We started doing soy and swine. Everybody's value added increased. And if you do that for 70 years, you get the world that we know. Mm-hmm. What's happening now is that single hole is breaking down. And so we now have to retrace every single economic sector and see what it looked like before this grand merger started in the 1950s. And in most parts of the world, it means reverting back to not just something that existed pre-1945, but something pre-industrial. Because a lot of the technologies that are required to do mass agriculture or manufacturing or finance can be imported, but that doesn't mean that they were necessarily mastered. And if you can't keep your own supply chain and input system sustainable within whatever countries you can reach in a post-globalized system, then you just can't play. And so we're going to see, for example, a lot of Russian crude fall off the market. We're going to see a lot of Brazilian soy fall off the market. We're going to see Chinese manufacturers fall off the market. And we're all going to have to learn to do things differently or get by without. In the case of North America, it's a differently thing. And we're already, courtesy of Donald Trump, surprisingly well on our way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. So what's the worst case? Actually, my first question is this reversible?
It would take the United States re-engaging a large number of countries and to rebuild something like the original globalization deal at Bretton Woods. We subsidize your economic systems in exchange for control of your security apparatus. But I'm not sure that's possible anymore. Because of
because the main threats don't even want to be a part of it.
Right, exactly. I mean, you'd have to spook the main threats to being a part of it, or convince everyone else that the Chinese and the Russians are the main threats, because that's how the U.S. sees that. You'd have to be on our security program.
Right.
But I don't think it's possible anymore. It was one thing to subsidize the global system in 1946. There wasn't a global system.
Right.
But we've had 100 odd countries grow explosively in the time since then, especially since 1992. And we've retooled our military that I'm not sure even if we could get buy-in that we could still do it. So during the Cold War, we had the Reagan Navy, as it was called at the end, where we had hundreds of ships that were patrolling the global oceans, and there were no real counter navies. The two largest navies in the world outside of our own were Japan and the UK, and they were allies. That's not where we are anymore. We have retooled our military to be country smashers. So we just floated the Ford. That's the most powerful military platform we've ever had. All by itself, it can take on any but 7 of the world's largest air forces. That's if you're fighting fair, and the Navy does not fight fair. Carriers move. That's the idea. You choose when the fight happens. So really just the top 3, one of which is ours. We're going to have 4 of those, in addition to the 10 Nimitz. This is how you destroy a country. That's not how you patrol the global oceans. You need destroyers for that. You need hundreds of them, maybe at least 800. We have 70. Half of them are defending the carriers. So we don't even have the military theoretical capability of rebuilding things like we did back in the 50s and the 60s.
Yeah, I mean, the scale is just so much larger that it's not, I kind of mentioned this before, it's just not practical, and when I asked, is this the reason this has happened? It's to an extent inevitable, because the scale just keeps getting larger and larger and larger, and it becomes impossible to keep up. And even though there is, basically bipartisan consensus to invest more in our Navy and build more ships, but not to the scale of 800 destroyers. I mean, it becomes an impossible
the Navy
feat.
we have right now is actually, I would argue, right-sized for our economic and strategic needs. It's only if you want to become the global policeman again that we need to change it. And I don't think there's a lot of support for that right now.
It just because it's so daunting of a task. Whereas before it wasn't the mere threat could probably put people in their place. These days, it takes a little bit more than a threat. Takes a little bit of action. I think Trump actually, again, I usually applaud his foreign policy instincts. They're a little bullyish, but with a little bit of action and a lot of threatening, he's able to kind of keep things in order. That's changed pretty drastically. Or we seem to be doing the exact opposite now. So what do you think? What do you think are worst case scenarios, best case scenarios, most likely scenarios? I mean, you have in your book that we might see 1 billion people die of famine.
I think that's the low case, unfortunately. I think that's the best case scenario at this
Super
point.
optimistic.
Yeah, well, we're seeing it with the Ukraine war. The global fertilizer distribution system is already breaking down. So in the United States, we've already had substantial crop switching away from food crops into things like hay. And in the rest of the world, they're just using less fertilizer. So we won't have a good idea for just how big the global shortage is going to be until probably the second week of September. That's when we usually get our first big estimates for most of the Northern Hemisphere's planting. And that's just the start of this, because it takes 3 years to rebuild a nitrogen or a phosphate supply chain system, and 10 years for potash. So, whatever we are facing in September, that's the beginning, at least 3 years of that, probably a lot more. And in the case of Brazil, they were luckily able to surge their imports of fertilizer, but then it just stopped. So they have enough for this season, but nothing for next. And that's the world's 3rd largest exporter. So the famine starts at the end of this year. Now, I'm not worried about the United States. Even with significant crop switching, we're still a massive exporter, largest in the world. And keep in mind that if you raise the price of wheat by 100%, the cost of a loaf of bread in the US only goes up by 25 cents. So we don't subsidize our food production system in the way that a lot of the poorer countries in the world do. But wow, look out for North Africa, Middle East, and South Asia. They're going to really be hurting later this year.
So, I mean, and the reason I asked about worst case, best case, most likely, one, it's a kind of a military way of asking a question, of course.
Sure.
I know you've briefed military before, but also because it does seem like, the likely future, the actions that we control aren't a complete, isolationist streak. That's not going to be a complete decoupling from the world. It'll just be a lot less so than maybe it was.
We'll play favorites, absolutely.
And but let's even say that we all decided that we do need 1,000 ships to patrol the seas, and we don't want any thing to happen to shipping containers, nothing. We're going to make sure that global trade continues to exist. Is this fate that you're describing still inevitable because of the demographic collapses around the world?
I'd argue yes. The economic models that we have become used to, whether it's fascism or socialism or capitalism, they're all based on the concept of populations getting bigger and the pie getting bigger. It's just an argument over how you divvy up the pie. That's not the case anymore. Europe's been in terminal decline for 20, 30 years, Japan for 40, and China for 40. So within this next decade, we're going to be seeing a large number of countries, first and foremost China, where that aged bulk moves into mass retirement and beyond. We don't have an economic model for that. It's certainly not based on mass international transport of consumer goods for consumption, because you need young people for consumption, and that is no longer an option in about a third of the world. And about another third of the world is too poor to really move the needle.
That kind of gets to another question. I was curious what your take was, which is, how do you factor in governing systems to all of these equations? I mean, you focus on really big, inevitable trends, and it's a lot of people don't, which is, I think, what makes your work interesting. And also, I mean, it's almost so simple that it's so obvious. You'd think more people would start at that very high level. But what about governing systems? I mean, do you have a preference on what kind of governing system works, just based on your really solid read of history and events around the world? Obviously, we have this democratic republic. China has whatever China has, this sort of mercantilist fascist system. And, Europeans have their extreme welfare states. How do you see the future in governing systems?
In my work, I don't really have a preference. Governing systems usually are a manifestation of the local culture as shaped by their geography. So United States is kind of the classic case of a hands-off government, because for most of our history, we didn't need a government. The land was inexpensive, the rains came regularly, agriculture was easy, transport was easy, and so the government only formed to do a handful of things that were needed as it was necessary. So we mustered up an army in order to fight our wars, but then we demustered them. We helped build a little bit of basic infrastructure linking our river basins, and then that was it. And then there were some protective tariffs on manufactured goods, and that's it. And honestly, it was like that until World War I. World War I was the first time where we had to make a significant change to our system, and that has carried on to this day. But that's one of the reasons why the United States ultimately has a light touch. I know it doesn't feel like that today, but compared to the rest of the world, the U.S. has a very light touch when it comes to things like regulation.
Even Republicans would agree with that statement. We're still better off than everybody else. We just want more.
Yeah, fair enough. Me too. That's not how it works in Europe. In Europe, everyone's in everybody's faces all the time. There are always challenges, internal and external. And so whereas our government just kind of comes together as it's necessary, they have to have a government all the time. And if their government does not punch above its weight, if it's not professional, if it doesn't think forward, the country dies. So there's a pretty high bar there. We think of local government as where like nearly failed people sometimes go into. In Germany, that is the height of honor to serve in local government, because you decide what is allowed to work.
Yeah, I wish it were that way here too. I think it should be that way here, because
we haven't professionalized it in the way that the Europeans have, because we haven't had to. I agree that would be a great direction for us to push into in the future, one miracle at a time. In China has a war government. The northern Chinese were kind of like Europe, all in each other's faces. And so they fought among themselves over and over and over for centuries, for millennia, to decide who could be in charge. And then they impressed their will on the rest of China. So they see governance as an occupation. It shapes who they are, and it shapes how they react to everyone else around them. And that's one of the fun things about governance, is you can have something that makes perfect sense for you, for your country, that's tailored for what you need. And then you interact with another country, and it all goes to hell very, very quickly. So we push trade deals that reflect our light government touch, and the rest of Europe is like, what? Why would we do that? Why would we take all of these gains and just throw them out the window? And then, of course, the Chinese see it as a battle.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And they make that very clear. So in this dark future, who will be our best allies? I mean, who else is going to come out of this all right, besides just North America?
Well, let me give you the obvious ones, and then we can talk about the ones I hope for. So there are a number of countries around the world who realize that the security paradigm of their home is dependent upon having a bigger friend somewhere else. And it's not that they're security consumers. It's just that they understand that there's a certain scratch each other's backs.
Mhm.
So top of the list, Australia. Culturally, they are the most similar country to us. Physically, they're the furthest away, and they've got a great chunk of land that kind of sits across from any number of regions that we're going to care about.
Mhm.
First and foremost on that list is Southeast Asia, who I kind of see coming along for the ride and being part of a post-globalized American neo-trading network. Japan was in the wind for a while. Japan's always been its own thing, but under Trump basically threatened all the allies that he would withdraw troops unless they ponied up. And while most countries dithered and deferred, the Japanese tipped us. And then as soon as Biden came in, they cut another deal with Biden. So any world leaders who can cut a deal with Trump and Biden, that tells you that across the entire American political spectrum, they're comfortable.
Japanese are pretty practical people.
Absolutely. Well, they are now. They didn't used to be.
They had a history. We all remember.
Yes.
Kind of crazy.
So Japan, for example, was the third country to sign up for the Russia sanctions. That is not something they would have done 10 years ago, much less 40 years ago. So Japan is now in kind of the friends and family program that I consider. The UK is desperately trying to figure out what Brexit means. And once they do, they realize they're going to have to apply for an NAFTA membership, and we will allow them in with certain conditions, just like we have done with every other deal we've ever cut with them. Scandinavia looks pretty good. It didn't 5 years ago, but the Russia war and the Finns and the Swedes rushing to get into NATO has changed minds up there. So whether it's Denmark, Sweden, Finland, or Norway, or Iceland, I think they're going to be part of the network as well. The two that are likely, but some things have to be worked out, France. The French will always be French. That's part of their charm.
Yeah.
But they're an independent military. They never sunk their economy into the globalized system.
No.
And they have very firm ideas about how Western Europe should operate. And they really don't care about the rest of the world so much. So they're
French.
Exactly. It's a situation where we have a lot in common, and the places where we clash are not core interests for either of us. And then the most important one, and
I've got to say, they're much smarter on energy policy than the rest of Europe.
Well, yeah, that's a low bar, but yes.
It's a low bar.
Yeah. The one that I'm most concerned about, but ultimately is most important in the long term, is Mexico. They're our largest trading partner. They're our second largest demographic partner. The southern border of the U.S. is the most crossed border in the world before you consider the illegal migration. So, this is the most important economic access in the world for the next century. I would like for us to get along a little bit better. The two things that would need to change is that people like the Mexican president AMLO just need to go away. And number two, Americans really need to stop snorting cocaine. If we could get those two things changed, things would be so much better.
But we'd have so much less energy.
Yeah, I think we'd find a way to get by.
All right, a lot to react to there. Yeah, let's talk about South America a little bit. I went to high school in Bogota, Colombia. I know South America pretty well, know Latin America pretty well. I've long said that we need a serious foreign policy refocus on South America in general. If not just for the reasons that you state, that things will be more regionalized, but we just have an interest in stability near us. The more unstable things are, the more of these damn migrant caravans are going to get across the border.
That's not something I really worry about. Two things. Number one, the birth rate fell out of Mexico and Central America about 20 years ago. So I don't mean to suggest that this is not an issue of the moment. I'm telling you, it's not going to be an issue of 10 years from now, because
even Central America.
Yeah, a little bit later than Mexico, but a sharper drop off. And
that's the really urbanization trends.
Yeah, exactly. Urbanization is a big piece of it. So I don't mean to suggest that migration from the South is going to stop, but the idea that there can be mass waves, they're not going to have the folks for it. And then walking from South America north is very difficult.
It is, and they still do it. But migration is just one thing that would,
Agreed.
One consequence. There's plenty of others, right? Like, lack of a cheaper labor force that we're going to want in this new environment, right? Because right now that's focused on East Asia, as you've noted before. I love Colombia, and I have my 20-year high school reunion in Colombia this December. So this is a story of true success, and American involvement at just the right levels that I think brought a country out of. We'll see how this presidential election goes for them, because that could really turn things around in a very terrible way.
I'm not too worried about that. I mean, I look at the candidates that are in there, and obviously there's a political decision to be made here, and that will shape the country. But it's not like this is someone like AMLO, and it's certainly not someone like Fidel. There's a broad agreement across the ideological aisle in Colombia that they're at a moment of decision, and Chile was in this a few years ago too. It's up to them how they treat it, but they already have a trade deal with the United States. So the hard stuff is done. It's a question about what the shape of the future looks like, and that is their decision to make.
Well, I hope so, but I'm a little bit more pessimistic about Petro and what he could do. I mean, by all accounts, he seems to be this Maduro-esque type of guy, and it could just turn the country backwards. And
sure, just remember, Colombia is not Venezuela. Venezuela has one major city, and then a lot of areas that kind of cling on. There are three major cities that are broadly disconnected in Colombia. So even if you change the presidency, it's not like all those regional power centers are just going to snap to.
Yeah, well, I hope so. And I believe in the Colombian people. I know them pretty well. Okay, another question. I have many questions, obviously. You're writing your work. It's very observational. Like you don't make a lot of judgments about who should have done what when. Can I get you to make some judgments?
Sure.
Like, what are some major mistakes made, and then maybe what should we be doing to prepare for this future?
Just keep in mind that whenever someone's going to make a judgment, they're coming from their own moral code and their own normative view of what should happen. And I don't have a lever to affect that. So if people ask me, I will of course tell them, but they might not be aiming for the same future that I am.
Yeah. Well, let's just say human flourishing is the future that we're hoping for.
Well, that's a high bar. Let's see. If I was going to choose one thing to do different, I would say that back during the Clinton and the W. Bush administrations, we should have spent about 20 times as much as we did on researching new green techs. Here we are in 2022. There's a broad assessment that the climate is an issue, and we have yet to develop a good technology for mass application that can actually address the problem. Today's solar and wind doesn't work on 80% of the world's surface, and we still don't have a good grid battery. And until we have that, everything else is just rearranging chairs.
I want to really dive into energy, but I want to do it after that particular question. So we're going to come back to energy.
Sure.
I've got a lot of questions on that. What else do we make a mistake on?
Baby boomers. There's so many things the baby boomers did wrong. It's really difficult to know where to start. However, you can link into immigration. Way back when, under Jimmy Carter, which is generally not considered one of our more successful presidents, the series of hurricanes hit Central America, and the Department of Immigration went down into Central America to hand out worker permits. And the idea is if you keep your nose clean, you can work, and after a certain amount of time, you can apply for an extension. You can get a ticket home, or you can get on the path to citizenship. And it was the only time in our history that we regularized the illegal immigration flows. And so we actually knew the size of the problem. If we had done something like that in the early 2000s, we would have already, from the additional tax inflows, paid for the entirety of the baby boomer retirement.
Yeah. You could say the same thing about Social Security and Bush's Social Security plan. We wouldn't be having a conversation about Social Security if that had happened. But Granny's getting thrown off a cliff, according to the headlines. So we didn't do it, and now we're screwed. Well, what about our debt?
Because Granny can vote, and she's got a lot of friends her age, so we just get to pay for it.
Yeah. Don't get me started on Social Security. It's very clearly an injustice against my generation, and it really makes me mad. But it's just a transfer of wealth from the poorest people in America to the wealthiest people in America. Right. You look at demography, like what's the best indicator of wealth? You don't know anything about somebody except immutable characteristics. It's going to be their age. So anyway, now you got me going. What about our debt? How you don't write a ton about this. I mean, talk about how China is really overfinanced, but there's a lot of people who are freaking out about debt up here. We don't do anything about it, but we're freaked out about it. There's a lot of people who think it's our greatest national security threat. What do you think?
I'm not nearly as concerned now. Let me start by saying I'm a fiscal conservative. So the idea of what I'm going to say, it kind of makes my stomach turn, but it really doesn't matter, or at least not yet. Let me put that from 3 points of view. Number one, if we issue new debt of $850 billion to $900 billion a year, that is about the same as our long-term GDP growth average. So that's kind of the floor that we can do without increasing the relative debt load. So that's kind of our bare minimum. Number two, the United States dollar is the sole global currency. And one of the things that the Ukraine war has shown us is that there are absolutely no pretenders to the throne.
Can I explain number one?
Sure.
Because I'm not sure that makes sense to a lot of people. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong about what you're saying, but you're saying mathematically, we won't actually increase our debt to GDP ratio. And yet we can still go into debt every year as long as that yearly deficit is equal to our growth. So that does require some growth.
Right, sure. I mean, our long-term growth rate is 2.5 to 3%. So with our GDP in its current size, that means we can deficit spend the entire defense budget right now. Just to give you an idea of scale.
I just want to, okay, I thought that's what you were saying. I wanted to clarify for the audience.
Yeah, sure. Second, when you're the global currency, a lot of the rules don't apply, and that is totally not fair, but it is still totally true. Most countries, most trade use the US dollar as the lubricant of exchange, whether in trade or in their own internal systems. Remember, the US dollar is the second most used currency in every country in the world, except for in the countries where it's the #1 used currency. It is the primary store of value, and more store of value is held outside of the United States than within, which means we're in this weird little system where we can print currency and they have to suck it up. It's rude. It's not fair. It's still true.
Also very confusing. Monetary policy is a tough one. It feels like make-believe to a lot of people.
Oh, and I totally get it. And then we get to the third thing. Fiat's the new norm. We used to have asset-backed currencies, backed by gold or copper, whatever it happened to be. And what people forget about the good old days is they weren't all that good old. You would have one of those that worked in the world, because it would attract other people because they wanted that asset-backed nature. And the more successful it was, the more of the gold or the copper that you needed to back it, which meant that every country that had a successful asset-backed currency had to physically expand and go to war for more assets. And that ultimately undid all of them. So fiat is a bad idea for secondary currency, but it's a great idea for a primary one because you're no longer face that restriction. So we're now in this weird, strange world where the less involved the United States is, the more stable its currency is because it's not involved in the trading matrix. So countries that are not even trading with the United States now see the US dollar as really their only option, even as the United States kind of melts away from the international scene. And when that's the environment, inflating the value of the currency, inflating the supply of the currency by 10% a year, it's really not that big of a deal.
Okay, so what policies should we be enacting now to prepare for this brave new world that we're talking about?
We need mass technical education for everyone under 25.
Hell yeah, I agree
Shop
with that.
back in school, electronics. Most companies that I work with, and most of my business is from consulting for firms now, is their primary concern is labor. Mexican labor has stopped coming to the United States. Inward migration from Mexico has been negative for 12 of the last 13 years now. And there is a particular shortage in the sorts of jobs that the baby boomers were known for. They were kind of our last broad cadre employment block, where they didn't just do white collar, they did blue collar, they did the trades, they did agriculture. Anything that was part of that broad spectrum that wasn't just top management, we have a shortage of now. And we're going to have a shortage of for at least the next 25 years. So anything you can do to bring businesses into schools earlier in the process, grade school I'm talking, in order to build out those skill sets and make kids aware that there are job opportunities besides designing video games, would be great. And in the states and the cities that have done this, it's been a runaway success, but we need an order of magnitude bigger at least.
Agree with that. Is that the main thing?
That's absolutely the single biggest limiting factor we are facing for the United States build out. Because remember, we're losing our largest generation. We're being replaced by the Zoomers, who are our smallest ever generation. At the same time, we need to roughly double the size of the industrial plant to manufacture back. That takes people. It takes people with skill sets that we are not particularly rich with at the moment. And if we can solve that, everything else is so much easier.
Yeah, and it's difficult. We argue about how best to tackle that. At least there's bipartisan consensus that it's something we need. You know, that this 4-year education just isn't for everybody. I mean, it worked for me, worked for you. It's just not. Somebody's got to be trained to do the plastic and injection molding. You know, it's got to happen.
And it's not. It doesn't look like it did in the 80s. I mean, that's all computerized now. So I mean, everything requires a degree of coding for a lot of these jobs. I mean, up to and including people who come and do project work at your house.
Hashtag learn to code. Okay, we'll go to energy. You have a long, really interesting kind of history on energy in your book, and you briefly mentioned the shortcomings with solar and wind, which is something I talk about a lot. Not just how it's not feasible in 80% of the world's geography, but also it takes 10 times more actual material to create the same amount of energy compared to a nuclear plant or gas plant, 100 times more land space. So it's just a very difficult thing. And until you solve the battery problem, which I don't think is even theoretically possible, then it's just not gonna ever be this main source of energy. I found it interesting that you barely mentioned nuclear energy at all in that entire discussion. You kind of brush by it. Well, why is that?
Oh, about half of there is a section in the industrial commodities chapter on it briefly, which explains why I didn't do it much elsewhere. Half of the world's uranium comes from Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan is sandwiched between Russia and China. And to think that it's going to be part of any trading system in the future is a reach. And then, of course, the second largest supplier is Russia proper. So you can have nuclear as part of the math in either Russia or China, but that's about it. Any place else, you're going to have to do some serious sourcing of your own stuff. Australia is going to provide some options. They're building out as quickly as they can, but for them to just sustain the reactors that are in generation right now, they would have to expand their output by a factor of 15. That's not going to happen. So there will be some specific countries that might be able to have a few reactors. But in the case of the United States, ours are 50 years old. They need to be decommissioned. New ones, I think, are a great idea, but there's a materials issue, there's an experience issue, there's a time issue, there's a regulatory issue, and they're just so much better, lower hanging fruit than nuclear, unfortunately, at this time.
Well, okay, so like what do you think we should be looking into?
Well, let's start with the ones that you don't like, wind and solar. There are places where it makes great sense. I mean,
Sure,
Texas is the #1 wind state for good reason. My home state of Iowa is #2. The whole Great Plains are brilliant. And while most utilities in most zones, the idea of getting to zero carbon is laughable, in that area, it makes sense. Also, West Texas is a great solar zone. And yes, it takes a lot of land, but if it takes a lot of land that's not in farm use, like in, say, West Texas, that's great. So the first metro in the United States to likely go 100% green is freaking Dallas-Fort Worth. And I don't think there are environmentalists in that city, but they just happen to be at the nexus of the right things. Omaha will probably be second. Denver will probably be third. So, it can work in certain places.
In certain places, yeah. Well, but the issue I bring up in Texas specifically is that there's simply a cap to how much it can really be utilized, because at a certain point it starts to displace the more reliable forms of energy. And we learned this for
solar. That's 100% true. For wind, it's not anymore. You get above about 650, 700 feet for the turbines, which is where they're going now. They tap stronger and more reliable wind currents. And so Texas is one of the handful of states that is actually now using wind for baseload.
Sometimes, not all the time, because when really bad weather, when we need energy the most, those are generally windless days, when it's really cold, like our Texas freeze, or when it gets really hot. And so what the effect it has had is a lack of investment in your more reliable forms of energy, gas in particular. Coal is going away anyway because of gas. Nuclear, because of the regulatory hurdles, is just not cost effective. Now, I would disagree slightly on the uranium problem, simply because we could just reprocess all of our waste in America and power the country for a long time. if we, again, that's a policy issue.
It's also a chemistry issue. Yes, we can, but that generates a lot of plutonium as a byproduct. And then you have a civilian plutonium supply chain. That is something that, as a rule, I would try to avoid.
Well, because of the nuclear proliferation weapons issue. Yeah. I mean, we can control it. I mean, it's a very tightly controlled process. We could do it. I mean,
it is technically feasible, but yes, you're talking about having tons and tons of plutonium as a byproduct, weapons grade plutonium as a byproduct every year. And if you get like 10 kilos of that stuff, you have a bomb.
That's true. And maybe we need more bombs. I don't know, but anyway, it's feasible. So anyway, those are the concerns I have on the renewable side.
Yeah, I'm absolutely with you on natural gas. It's more flexible. It's less carbon intensive. It's produced at home. We have a methane leakage issue to solve, but that is something that everyone in the industry broadly agrees is an issue, and they are working on it. I don't mean to suggest they're going to solve it tomorrow, but it's not something that is being ignored. The big advantage of natural gas over the more intermittent stuff isn't just its reliability. It's just by definition, your wind turbines and your solar panels are not in your population center. And so the weather that you are adapting to with your energy usage locally does not necessarily match up with the production quotient that you have a few hundred miles away. Natural gas, you don't have to worry about that. Natural gas plants, as a rule, are located within 50 miles of their population center, and they can ramp up and ramp down in 10 to 15 minutes.
What as far as other things we should be doing? I mean, you didn't mention when you talk about it a lot in the book, but the need to source minerals, rare earths, all of these things, at least somewhat locally, or at least with our friends and family network. We have a real problem permitting this kind of behavior in America right now. In Minnesota, they just axed a couple different mines that would produce a crap ton of cobalt and nickel. They've been threatening the Arizona mine that produces copper for a while now. And the Build Back Better plan that was axed. Luckily, the Build Back Better plan was also axed. Do we need to get our heads out of our, to if we're going to again survive in this new world?
I think that the low-hanging fruit for the United States, and a lot of that is just recycling. The Japanese have shown that if you mine your own trash, you can solve about half of your material inputs issues in a relatively low-cost environment.
Yeah, interesting.
Not as low cost as we have become used to in kind of this throwaway society that we have around the world for the last 20 years, but something that would not regenerate too much of an inflation pulse, and you don't have to pay that once. Additionally, while there are huge restrictions on every industrial commodity, whether because the processing is China or the sourcing is in Russia or it's in Africa or wherever it happens to be, people forget that we have the whole Western hemisphere here. And most of what we need, not all, most of what we need is within the hemisphere. Now, that, if anything, maybe requires a little bit more of a mindset shift than simply regulation at home. We have to have better relations with countries like Bolivia, which is a country that is very difficult to have a positive conversation with for anyone. But the materials are here. Now, the technologies in play for most of the advanced technologies we're looking at today, including most of the green tech that we're having today, the Western Hemisphere is the only option for getting most of the materials all in one place. Everywhere else, it's kind of scattered, and a lot of times it's behind war zones. So we're having that issue right now with copper and aluminum in Russia, for example. So if these are the technologies we're going to use and depend upon, you are looking at large portions of the world just not playing because they can't get the materials to make the stuff in the first place. And then there's an intermediate step we're gonna have to worry about that I'm not too concerned of. Right now, you might produce the lithium in a place like Argentina, but it's processed in China. The same happens for iron ore. The same happens for bauxite. All the processing is in China because it's a low value added thing that the Chinese workforce can do that's very capital intensive. It kind of plays to their strengths with the way they manage. We're going to have to rebuild a lot of that somewhere else. Now, luckily, the United States is going to have the smallest capital adjustment. I'm anticipating a bit of a financial crisis globally. For the US, it'll be less intense. And the United States, courtesy of the shale revolution, has the cheapest electricity in the world. So we're already seeing a lot of steel foundries coming back. Aluminum is starting to kind of sniff around the edges. Copper will probably be next. And there's nothing about lithium processing that is necessarily difficult. It just requires the space and the energy. I'm not so concerned about lithium because I don't think it's a very good battery chemistry. I would rather see us invest more in finding a better chemistry, but one miracle at a time.
Yeah, I mean, that's another question: is technological innovation gonna solve a lot of these future problems? But I mean, you write in your book that it's the opposite trend that's going to happen. We're going to
Yeah.
have less tech. We've seen massive leaps in technology over the last couple decades, and you think that's going to slow?
Yeah, I think if there was a moment in time, you need a lot of young workers, and the world is running out of those. You need a
Mhm.
huge degree of interconnectivity, and we're probably going to see the world breaking up a bit. And you need a huge amount of capital to fund the research. And with the baby boomers moving to retirement, they're taking their money with them. And then finally, you need a huge market to apply it to generate the revenues for the next wave. And that requires an unbroken market, and that is already gone.
You don't mention Africa very much. Why is that?
Africa is a series of 5 stacked plateaus. The internal transport's always been difficult. And so once the world industrialized or started to industrialize in the early 1800s, the Africans couldn't take advantage of those technologies to the same degree that a lot of the rest of the world did. And so technologically and economically, they got left behind. Looking forward, it's a mixed picture. Part of it is as the global system breaks up, a lot of the African countries are going to have some of those materials that the rest of the world really needs. But while Africa is not as industrialized as the rest of the world, they are no longer unindustrialized. They can put up a fight. There will not be a new scramble for Africa colonial style. It'll have to be more in partnership. And it's going to take both sides years to figure out what the comfortable operating environment is that's going to slow everything down. And in the meantime, we are going to have global food shortages that start at the end of this year. So Africa will be struggling through this period of trying to figure out its role. At the same time, there's just not enough food.
Yeah, real rosy picture, Peter. Thank you. We could probably go on for a while, but I know you got another interview, and they just called votes here in the Capitol.
I hear that's important. You should probably go.
It's an important thing. Really appreciate it. I think this is, like I said, I was really looking forward to this one, and I got through your very long book pretty quickly because it's entertaining, it's interesting, it's original, and I highly recommend it. So congrats on
Thank you.
that.
You do know it's available in audio, right?
Yeah, no, I didn't, but I prefer, I prefer not audio. It's hard for me to read, but I still prefer it if I can get through it. The iPad worked out just fine for me. Also, I had to start reading it before it was officially out to prepare for this, so didn't have the audio version. No, this is great. Really appreciate it, Peter. Thank you.
My pleasure. Take care.